The year is somewhere around 4000 BC. The sky is immense and unbroken by anything taller than a scraggly tamarisk tree or the rough, uneven wall of a settlement that could generously be called a town. The air smells of livestock dung, burning wood, and something fermented that you cannot quite identify. Around you, a few hundred people are already moving before the sun has fully cleared the horizon. Children carry clay pots toward a canal that runs brown and slow. Men sharpen tools made from flint and obsidian. A woman near a low doorway kneads grain against a flat stone, her arms working in a rhythm so practiced it looks almost mechanical. This is not the distant, abstract past of textbooks. This is a living, breathing, dangerous, and deeply human world sitting right at the edge of everything we would eventually become. We are standing roughly at the boundary between what archaeologists call the Chalcolithic period and the early Bronze Age. It is a threshold era, a time when human beings are beginning to do something they have never done at quite this scale before. Gather in permanent settlements, develop social hierarchies, specialize their labor, and fight organized wars over the resources that make settlement possible. The archaeological record from this period, particularly from sites like Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, Tel Brak in Syria, and Ain Ghazal in Jordan, shows us a world in rapid, sometimes violent transformation. Villages are growing into proto-cities. Trade networks stretching hundreds of miles are beginning to connect people who have never met. And alongside all of this, something else is stirring. The first real formalization of power. Kas, the emergence of warrior classes, chieftains, and the brutal logic of territorial control. Into this world, the ancient traditions place figures that have haunted human imagination for millennia. The book of Genesis, in one of its most cryptic and disputed passages, speaks of a time before the great flood when the sons of God came to the daughters of men and fathered children with them. Children who became the Nephilim, described in the text as mighty ones. Men of renown, figures of enormous power and stature who walked the earth in those days. The apocryphal Book of Enoch, a text revered in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, expands this tradition dramatically. It names the fallen watchers, 200 in number, who descended upon Mount Hermon, took human wives, and taught humanity forbidden knowledge. Metalworking, warfare, cosmetics, sorcery, and the art of making weapons. According to that ancient tradition, it was this transgression, the mixing of the divine and the mortal, the unleashing of violence and forbidden craft, that prompted the catastrophe of the flood. Scholars and theologians have debated the meaning of these passages for centuries. Some read them as literal supernatural history. Others interpret the Nephilim as a memory of a warrior aristocracy, a ruling class so physically imposing, so militarily dominant, that they seemed to their contemporaries to be something more than human. What makes the tradition fascinating from a historical standpoint is not whether it is literally true, but what it tells us about how the people of this era understood their own world. They were living through an age of rising violence. Fortified walls were going up, weapons were becoming more sophisticated, and certain men, through physical power, skill at combat, or access to resources, were beginning to rise above the rest in ways that felt almost supernatural to those beneath them. Ancient texts describe what people believed was happening in the unseen realm. And those beliefs shaped how they organized their societies, justified their hierarchies, and made sense of the brutality they witnessed. Let us walk through what that brutality actually looked like on the ground. By 4000 BC, warfare in the ancient Near East was not yet the organized, state-sponsored machine it would become under the Assyrians or Egyptians. But it was real. It was common, and it was reshaping the landscape of human settlement in ways the archaeology makes unmistakable. At sites across the Fertile Crescent, archaeologists have found evidence of what they call a pattern of nucleation. Small, scattered farming villages, gradually abandoning their locations and clustering together into larger, more defensible settlements. Why? The most compelling explanation is fear. People were coming together not primarily for trade or shared resources, though those mattered too, but because there was safety in numbers when raiders came. The raiders themselves were often neighboring groups facing the same pressures: drought, soil exhaustion, population growth that was outpacing the carrying capacity of the land, a bad harvest in a world without storage technology, without refrigeration, without any real agricultural surplus. It was not an economic inconvenience. It was a death sentence unless you could take what someone else had grown. Raiding was not evil in the moral vocabulary of this world. It was survival. It was strategy. And the men who were best at it accumulated something precious: status. In a settlement where most men spent their days bent over a field or tending goats, the warrior who could protect the community, or who could successfully lead a raid on the next valley, occupied a position that looked, to everyone around him, like something close to divine favor. Archaeologists have found the physical evidence of these men in burial sites from this period. Across the ancient Near East and into the Caucasus, the Chalcolithic era produced a category of burial that stands apart from the rest: graves containing weapons, prestige objects, and sometimes bodies that show signs of exceptional size and physical robustness. At sites associated with what researchers call the Maikop culture in the northern Caucasus, dating to roughly this period, elite burials have been found containing gold and silver vessels, elaborate copper weapons, and signs of feasting and ceremony that speak to a social world organized around the glorification of powerful men. These were not ordinary farmers. These were something else: a warrior class, marked out in death as they were marked out in life. Daily existence for the people around these emerging warrior elites was shaped by conditions we would find almost unbearable. Settlements of this period were dense, unwalled in some cases, surrounded by animal pens that shared space with human habitation in ways that made the transmission of disease nearly inevitable. Humans and their livestock lived in close, intimate proximity. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs were not kept at a distance. They were folded into the settlement for protection and utility, their waste accumulating in layers that archaeologists can still core through today, reading the compressed history of ancient disease vectors in the sediment. Studies of coprolites, fossilized human waste, from this period have identified the eggs of intestinal parasites, including roundworm, whipworm, and tapeworm. Nearly everyone carried a parasite burden. Nearly everyone had experienced dysentery. Life expectancy in settlements like these rarely exceeded 35 years, and infant mortality was catastrophic. And roughly half of all children born did not survive their first 5 years. Water was the central obsession and the central terror of daily life. The great river systems of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, were life-giving and treacherous in equal measure. Their annual floods, driven by snowmelt from the mountains of Anatolia, could turn fertile fields into swamps in a matter of days. But those same floods deposited the rich silt that made the alluvial plains among the most productive agricultural land on Earth. By 4000 BC, communities along these rivers had already developed basic irrigation systems, channels dug by hand to redirect floodwaters into fields, early attempts to domesticate the river's violence for human benefit. The people who controlled those channels controlled the food supply, and the people who controlled the food supply controlled everything else. Drinking water came from these same rivers, from shallow wells, and from collected rainwater. None of it was clean by any standard we would recognize today. The same channel that watered the grain field ran past the animal pens and the communal waste areas. Waterborne illness was the background noise of existence. Cholera, typhoid, and a range of parasitic infections moved through communities along the same paths as the water itself. People did not understand germ theory. They understood that certain water made you sick and certain water did not. Over generations, communities developed practical knowledge about safer sources without ever articulating why one spring was better than another. This kind of embodied, transmitted knowledge was itself a form of power, when the elder who knew which water would not kill your children was worth listening to. Food preparation was labor-intensive in ways that leave traces even now. Grain was the foundation. Emmer wheat, einkorn, and barley formed the caloric backbone of the diet. Processing it was overwhelmingly the work of women. Using saddle querns, flat stone grinding tools that required the user to kneel and push a smaller stone across a larger one in a forward rocking motion. Women spent hours of every day reducing grain to a coarse flour that was then mixed with water and cooked on flat stones or in rudimentary clay ovens. Skeletal analysis of women from this period shows a distinctive pattern of stress injuries. Enlarged attachments on the toes and knees from prolonged kneeling. Arthritic damage to the shoulders and arms from years of grinding. The flour itself was contaminated with grit from the quern stones, and dental wear on ancient skulls from this period is often severe, with teeth worn nearly to the gum line in middle-aged individuals. Supplement to this grain diet came from legumes, lentils, chickpeas, and bitter vetch, alongside garden vegetables, wild plants gathered from the margins of fields and riverbanks, fish from the rivers where available, and occasional meat from domesticated or hunted animals. Meat was not a daily food for most people. An animal slaughtered was an animal that could no longer produce milk, labor, or offspring. Meat eating was associated with ceremony, with feast days, with the aftermath of successful raids, and with elite status. The warrior who feasted on beef while others ate lentil porridge was making a statement as much as a meal. The built environment of these settlements was itself a record of social hierarchy becoming visible in the landscape. Mud brick, the universal building material of the ancient Near East, was not a single, undifferentiated technology. Elite buildings at sites like Uruk from this period show thick walls, multiple rooms, and elevated platforms that place the powerful above the ordinary. Common dwellings were single-room structures, low-ceilinged, dark, except for a small opening that served as both window and smoke vent. Their floors packed earth that absorbed the moisture of the season and the bacteria of years. Sleeping was on reed matting or animal skins directly on this floor, close to whatever fire was still smoldering. Sharing warmth with other family members and sometimes with young animals brought in against the cold of winter nights. This world was loud in ways we rarely imagine. Not with machinery or traffic, but with animal noise. Settlements of several hundred people surrounded by their herds produced a constant soundscape of bleating, lowing, barking, and the crying of children. At night, the darkness was total. A few oil lamps burning animal fat gave off a dim, smoky light that served more to mark the presence of the living than to illuminate anything. Beyond the settlement walls, the darkness was absolute, genuinely dangerous. Wolves, lions, and leopards ranged across the ancient Near East in this period. Going outside at night alone was a genuine risk. And the wall that separated the settlement from the surrounding landscape was as much a psychological boundary as a physical one. The difference between the human world and everything beyond it. The people who managed and navigated this world were not simple. They were solving extraordinarily complex problems with limited tools. how to store enough food to survive a bad harvest, how to organize the labor of a community so that irrigation channels were dug and maintained, how to adjudicate disputes over land and water in ways that did not fracture the community apart, how to integrate the violence of warfare into a social order that still needed farmers to grow grain and mothers to raise children. The traditions they developed, the stories they told about mighty men born between the divine and the human, about knowledge stolen from heaven and given to mortals, about a world so corrupted by violence that the heavens themselves broke open in judgment. Those traditions were not primitive attempts at science. They were sophisticated attempts to make meaning out of the conditions they were actually living in. Today, if you travel to the ancient site of Uruk in southern Iraq, you can stand on the remnants of a ziggurat platform that was already being built in this period, one of the earliest monumental structures in human history. The land around it is flat and dry, the Euphrates having shifted its course over millennia. There's not much to see with the naked eye, and yet the weight of what happened here is staggering. This is one of the places where the world as we know it began, where surplus grain became taxation, where taxation became bureaucracy, where bureaucracy required writing, where writing required schools. The chain runs from that mud brick platform to the screen you are watching this on, unbroken across 6,000 years. What we will never fully know is what it felt like to stand where those people stood. To look up at a night sky unblemished by any artificial light and see the Milky Way as a solid river overhead. To know your name in a world of a few thousand other people who knew your face. To understand violence as a weather pattern, something that came and went and had to be endured. To believe that the giants of the old stories had once walked this same ground, and that whatever had destroyed them might yet be satisfied by the prayers you offered before the fire. We can reconstruct the bones of this world. The flesh of it, the fear and wonder of it, remains just out of reach. And perhaps that is why we keep looking back. If you have a period, a mystery, or a figure from the ancient world you want to see reconstructed in a future episode, let us know in the comments. There is so much more to uncover.